Welcome to Babblecom 5.
So I'm just back from a week on holiday. Not too far away, but I'm a little bit sort of here and there in my body clock. I didn't sleep very well, so I'm a little bit sleep deprived, but that might be the perfect state to attack this review I think, in some respects, because this is actually quite a hard book. Becoming Superman by J Michael Straczynski. I have known about it for a few years now. This is the first time I've had a sort of spare holiday where I was able to actually sort of sit and just read, for a substantial amount of time. Somehow I never quite seem to find the time to do it when I'm just in my day-to-day. So I hadn't read too much about it before I started actually reading it. And I should say that I don't normally read autobiographies, or indeed biographies, full stop. It's just not really my thing. But one way or another, I've been interested in J Michael Straczynski's work for a very, very long time. And in fact, that interest started well before I was aware of who he was as a person, because I used to watch shows like the Real Ghostbusters and Jason the Wheeled Warriors, which were cartoons back in the 80s, and those were largely written by him. So his sort of nature of storytelling, had I but known, was actually very familiar to me by the time I came around to Babylon 5. Now, after Babylon 5 in the mid-90s, and obviously you may be familiar with the fact that I have a Babblecom 5 playlist on this very channel, where you can find out all about my sort of Babylon 5 rewatch and various other elements of the show that I've covered. But after Babylon 5, I rather lost touch with what JMS was doing. And I was aware that he was doing some comics, but I was slightly out in my comics phase, and I tend to collect collected forms of comics. So I wouldn't have been picking up his individual issues on the various runs of different characters that he was doing from time to time. So, strangely, I kind of reconnected with his work when I heard about Sense8. And I hadn't realised that this was something that he'd done, but I loved it a lot when I came to watch it. It was JMS and the Wachowskis who did it. And it was on Netflix, so Netflix exclusive. And well worth a watch if you haven't. Very much more mature content than Babylon 5 in terms of nudity and so on. But very, very JMS. Very, very science fiction. Really, very, very powerful series, I think. So if you haven't found that, tripped across it, do check that out. But this is what I actually want to talk about. This is Becoming Superman, and I'll pop a link in the description for you so you can go and have a look at it on Amazon if you'd like. There is an audio version of it read by Peter Jurassic, which I haven't listened to, but I have heard really good things about, and I am late to the game with this, as I often am with these things, because I wasn't on furlough during COVID, so it wasn't like I had loads of time to kill during that period of time. So this is the first opportunity I've had with that and everything else in my life to actually sit and read this. And it's ironic that I chose to read it whilst I was on holiday, because it's not really a light read, folks. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as a holiday read. And obviously I am going to talk a little bit in this review about what the contents of the book are, beyond the obvious. But I just want to warn you ahead of time, because I don't want to spoil you for it as such. But if you are at all interested in JMS's work, this book, I think, is a real eye-opener for how he came to be the author that we now know, and that we, if you're like me, grew up with. It doesn't perhaps go into quite as much nitty-gritty detail as I might have expected, but the reason for that becomes quite clear early on, because it was quite difficult to read. His early life was horrific. It's utterly horrific. I sat there reading it in the sun at a nice hotel, and I felt guilty as sin because he had none of that growing up at all. It's actually remarkable that he made it out of his childhood at all. This book is about him, figuratively becoming Superman. That was the persona that he adopted for himself to get himself through his childhood and beyond, and to survive in a world that more often than not just didn't want to listen to him. But more than that, it's about his determination to behave like Superman. Not to literally be him, but to figuratively be like him. So he shot himself in the foot so many times in the course of his career because he felt that it was the right thing for him to do. And I admire that massively. I mean, it's incredibly courageous and scary, and some would say stupid thing to do, especially in a place like Hollywood, because it's a dog-eat-dog world, clearly, and if you get blacklisted, which he did at points, then you are stuffed. It is classic sort of, I don't know, how do you describe it? It's just, behind the scenes stuff, basically. The whispers start, the rumours start, and you're fried, and you've had it. But fortunately, he had, the luck, the timing, the sheer devotion to his calling to get him through it. And he also showed incredible adaptability, I think, throughout, because he's covered the only medium I can think of that he hasn't actually hit on is computer games. And I actually tweeted that to him recently. I didn't get a response because he's a busy man, but he's done cartoons, he's done TV series, he's done films, he's done books, he's done comics. There is virtually nothing this man has not tackled, and tackled incredibly successfully. And this is all through his own self-motivation, because God knows he wasn't getting any help from the family side of things. I mean, he really wasn't. I don't normally get massively emotional about things that I'm just sort of reading, but by God, I was angry for him early doors. And he's very, very honest in this book about how he was feeling. I mean, he says that he has difficulty expressing his emotions in terms of, sort of a face-to-face kind of communication. He's had to kind of learn that over time, which I fully appreciate. But there doesn't seem to be any sort of gap there for him when it comes to writing and communicating through the written word. That he has no difficulty with whatsoever. And this book is very much that. You really feel like he's talking to you, and he's bringing you on the journey as he went through it, which is, I hesitate to say it's lovely, because in a lot of parts it's actually bloody uncomfortable to read. I mean, there are times when I really did genuinely wish ill upon people in the book, as indeed he did. And again, he's very honest about that, because you really just want these people gone from his life. You really want him to break free of it. And eventually he does, but it is by no means an instantaneous sort of prospect for him. And he has to make some really, really hard decisions along the way, and he has to make a conscious choice to take himself out of that situation altogether in order to move his life along and to hopefully ultimately help his family, those who want to be helped later. He has to sort of preserve himself first and foremost. I'm sure we've all had times when that's needed to be the case, where if you don't help yourself first, it's a bit like they say on planes, help put your own oxygen mask on first before you put on the oxygen mask of the person next door. And he had to take that view, and that's a really hard view to have to take, especially when he's the sort of person who will step into something if he feels that something isn't happening as it should. And there are some things that sort of really sort of resonated for me. There are some of the sort of the the more negative aspects of how he was affected by various issues. I've never been anywhere near as low in his life as he has been in terms of material wealth and all that sort of stuff. But certain things do chime for me, as they will probably chime for others, because it will come as no surprise to you to learn that I was quite sort of socially awkward, and that side of things has never come naturally to me, and probably still doesn't actually. And some of the things he was talking about in terms of kind of learned behaviours and sort of stock ways to approach things, I get that, and I'm sure a lot of other people would also sort of understand that, who were of a sort of similar way of thinking. So the book as a whole is this sort of remarkable telling of his own life, his parents, his grandparents, the sort of Russian background of the family. World War II comes into it a lot. It's quite fascinating for me actually, because when I was growing up, I read quite a lot of Isaac Asimov books, and Asimov started off writing short stories for magazines in the States in the sort of 50s, 60s. And JMS was doing something very, very similar. So he was also trying to sell stories to these magazines and get rejection after rejection. But we never had that equivalent in the United Kingdom that I was aware of personally. I think we had the odd one or two, but there were quite a few that would actively take freelance work in the United States. And that was how a lot of the science fiction writers of that time got going. And again, there are quite a few elements of this book that deal with people passing away, which was very, very sad to read, because it's a very, very personal thing to say goodbye to someone, and he shared quite a lot of those stories, because he did become very, very close to the cast and the crew of Babylon 5 over the 5+ years that they were together as an extended family. I think it would have been an incredibly special series to be on as part of the crew and the cast over the length of time. And again, he's very open about some of the difficulties that people in the crew and the cast were facing over time as well. Which, in some ways it's interesting, because, for me being a Babylon 5 fan, and the first one, I was thinking there might be more on Babylon 5 in there. But the thing is, although it was very, very, very much his brainchild, he talks in the book about how it came from two separate ideas that merged into one. And he realised they were actually the same idea, but could be done using each other. So I'd heard that, I think, on podcasts recently, but I never actually read this, and so never actually sort of read it firsthand myself until now. So that was really interesting. But beyond that, I don't think Legends of the Rangers got a mention. I don't think Lost Tales got more than a passing mention. I've only read it once. I haven't sort of gone back in detail, because I'm trying to do this fresh, whilst I'm still got that sort of my feelings from it. And there were times when I was nearly crying. There's a very successful rescue at one point in the book, which had me tearing up. Bless him. But as I say, there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of success. There's a lot of triumph over adversity. There's a lot of him dealing with how he lifts himself up from rock bottom and listens to his internal voice, and also just how far he pushes himself. And I remember over the course of Babylon 5, I saw him in 95, not long after the show started, and he wasn't big, but he's a tall guy, and he was very sort of, his presence was really there. But when I saw him again a couple of years later, he was much, much skinnier. And he was getting medical checks and stuff during the run of the series, because he was pushing himself so bloody hard. Because they didn't, and interestingly, it comes from the fact that there weren't really the funds to bring in freelancers to take some of the script writing load off him. So I don't think he actually intended to start out and write as many of the episodes of Babylon 5 as he did, but he felt he had no choice. So being JMS, he just threw himself at it and went for it. And what we got was the Babylon 5 that we got, with a very consistent voice past sort of the middle or so of season 2. it's all him, apart from one episode with Neil Gaiman doing the writing honours, and he does the foreword for the book, which I thought was nice. So this is it's very much, at the end of the day, it's about him adopting the persona of Superman and his sort of way of thinking as a means to become the opposite of what his dad was and how he was treating him growing up. So if you are sensitive about stories about abuse, alcoholism, any of those sorts of issues, this could be a very painful book for you to read. Now, JMS might say that's all the more reason for you to read it, because he's very much an advocate of doing what you fear, so that you either succeed at it or you fail at it, but at least you've tried to do it, which is an interesting outlook on life. I suppose what's fascinating, for my way of thinking, is that because he never had that much, he had very little fear of actually losing things. So he didn't really mind if, in choosing to do something completely different, he put himself at financial risk, because from his point of view, he'd been there, he'd done that. It didn't hold any real fear for him because he knew he could survive that. So he just went ahead and did stuff that no one else would have done because it was immensely risky, and they'd have been afraid of losing their sort of material things around them. And and to that extent, that also impacted his relationships as well, because he was self-aware enough to say, I'm sorry, but in order for me to do what I need to do to sort of answer my calling, I can't really afford a relationship, and I can't do kids because it would just sort of detract from this sort of drive that I have to push myself and to create. And he's the quintessential creator. He cannot not create. Even when he was on holiday, he was still scribbling notes in the bathroom because he couldn't not do it. It just couldn't. He couldn't let it not get out of him. So in that sense, it is really, really fascinating, and it's wonderful insight, as I say, into sort of the Hollywood of that era and how the studios worked at that point, because he was getting torpedoed left, right, and centre, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that when it comes to the Crusade reactions that I do, because it's a classic example of a show that was killed off because of studios taking certain decisions behind the scenes. And in fact, the other thing that is interesting in here is how the Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine sort of situation played out, because Babylon 5 was around as a concept for years before it actually got made, and it turns out that Paramount had that information for years before Babylon 5 got made. And when you line up Deep Space Nine with Babylon 5, you can call out an awful lot of similarities, and this book does delve into that. So if you are interested in that side of things, it's a good book for you. The book actually takes quite a while to get there, but what's interesting about that is I can start to call out things from the book that I can see that he probably put into Babylon 5 because of his life experience. And one of the things that really struck me about Babylon 5 right from the get-go, as opposed to Star Trek, was that it always felt really genuine, really authentic, just kind of, if we are still human beings as we are now, 200 years later, will we act and sound and talk like that? I thought, that is actually probably, unfortunately in some respects, more realistic than Star Trek's problems have been completely erased attitude. Now, obviously, Star Trek has had a lot of, what would you call them, soft reboots over time now, where perhaps we see that, there was more conflict. We weren't quite as perfect, perhaps, as, the flagship crew of the Enterprise would have made things out to be. So I think in that sense, the sort of Deep Space Nine, maybe even Voyager to a certain extent, does paint a slightly less rosy picture of humanity in the future as compared with Gene Roddenberry's early Trek work. And again, there's an interesting commentary point from JMS in there that Trek was easier to sell to the networks because it was a lot less controversial in some ways, because it didn't have the sort of violence aspect, it didn't have sort of profanity. So in that respect, it was actually an easier sell to the networks than Babylon 5 was, because to come in at the sort of the budget that was available for it, it had to use CGI, which had never been done before. So they actually had to convince the studios that they could do it using CGI, and they did as a test reel for that very purpose from Foundation Imaging, just to be able to try and sell studios on the concept that look, we can do this without expensive model work, and we can do it really, really well. And obviously, you look at it now, and yes, it looks dated now, and you can't kind of blow up the graphics very easy. But there are people who are upscaling it on YouTube, and you can see that if they were to do it today, it would be a whole different ball game, because every show is doing it today, effects wise. So that's now old hat. But Babylon 5, the 5-year story arc, never been done before, and it's quite funny as well, because JMS is basically saying, I couldn't even tell the studios that it was a 5-year story arc, really. Or, well, no, sorry, he told them that, but what he didn't tell them was that the characters would actually change over time, from being good to bad or bad to good, and sort of just sort of flipping them, because studios were used to shows just being steady state and going on for years and years, not doing anything radical with the characters. But obviously JMS wanted to flip that, because that was the whole point of his story writing. Wouldn't let him do something that was just static. That wasn't what he was about, and it was literally the sort of thing that he would die in a ditch for. Because when they asked him to do She-Ra, and then they asked him to do She-Ra in a different way, he walked away from it. He just went, because he could not in good conscience sit there and write a character in a way which he felt was not authentic. Which is it's an incredible ballsy move to actually risk yourself and your sort of professional reputation to do that. So I was saying, the fact that he was brave enough to do that speaks volumes about the man. And the funny thing is, I have met him briefly. I have a funny lift story about JMS, actually. In Manchester in 1995, there was a little convention called Wolf 359. Had 2 shows on it, Babylon 5 and Star Trek. I liked both, but I was more interested in Babylon 5 at that point. Although there was crossover, because Major Roddenberry was there. Anyway, relatively small hotel, and I think JMS was staying in the hotel. So at one point, myself and a couple of other people from one of the UK news groups found ourselves in a lift, a small lift with an elevator for the US audience, with JMS, and somebody had pressed the floor button for him, and the ping, and the doors opened, and it was the wrong floor. It wasn't the floor he asked for. And he just looked at the guy and deadpanned, "I trusted you." And to this day, it's nearly 30 years on now, that is still right up here, because it was hilarious. It was just absolutely spot on. And I also remember at one point, during a talk that he was giving, they for some reason the sort of auditorium had an open door onto the street, and there was this sort of conversation coming from a taxi driver, and James actually sort of paused at one moment, turned around and went outside so I talked to the taxi driver and came back in again, which was also brilliant. And it's funny because he's very, very self-deprecating about his abilities with an audience. He said he sort of threw up the first time he had to actually sort of talk to people in public, because there wasn't a lot of communication in his family early doors, so he found it really hard. But you wouldn't know it from seeing him on the sort of the convention circuits in the 90s, from my point of view. But I also love when he describes another occasion when he's on a red carpet, it's basically he's like the Invisible Man, even though he is legitimately on the red carpet for being the writer. And he's just actually taking photos of the other people on the red carpet because no one's taking photos of him. Bless him. But he has no ego about that. He is purely there to generate the material, and that is what he cares about, which is lovely. He is just there to tell the best stories that he can in the best way that he can. But it is a really, I found it a very powerful book. I was trying to get my son sort of interested in it, but he doesn't know it from Adam basically. But I was sort of giving him little sort of snippets from it, which he was neither here nor there about, which is fair enough. I get that, but it is just genuinely horrifying and sad and funny and heartwarming. There's a whole gambit of emotions that you could probably run through reading this book. And as I say, reading it on a sort of poolside in the sun was completely disingenuous on my part. But I honestly didn't know how it was going to go. I knew that he'd had certain very negative incidents in his life, but quite how much he had to overcome to get to where he is now, I had no idea. Because I think I mentioned that, I went from sort of Babylon 5, Crusade, Lost Tales, and then sort of knew he was doing comic stuff, but then he came back in Sense8. I wasn't actually aware that he'd done a film in between. And indeed, I think that the first time, this is it actually, the first time I realised that he was coming back into film and still very active was actually in Thor. Because I remember watching Thor the first time, and I looked at it and I thought, I swear I know that chap. Where do I know that guy from? And in Thor, Kenneth Branagh put him in the film, acting. I don't think he said anything, but he's the first guy to discover Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, on Earth, and he's the first guy to attempt to pick it up. And that was JMS, because JMS also wrote Thor, the film. And he's done the comics, and he's done Spider-Man comics, he's done Superman comics, which is lovely, because as he says, that gets quite meta. So not only did he become Superman, Superman then became because of him. Something like that. And I also saw just on Facebook just recently that he's going to be doing a run on Captain America as well. But he's done sort of, so he's done Wonder Woman, he's done elements that I know a lot of people remember very, very fondly. And I think he did a very, very long run on Thor. And Thor's one of those Marvel comics that I remember picking up when I was very little. And I remember it being old school back then. And what JMS was brought on to do was actually to change it and modernise it, which is exactly what he did. It's not a run of Thor that I'm very familiar with, but I think I have seen a few stories, and it is a very different version of him. And he updated the costume and the way he spoke, and all sorts of stuff like that. And the really interesting thing with JMS is he never mentions it's writer's block once. It's fascinating because clearly that's just never ever been a thing for him. He just writes. But it is very interesting that he started off. I think comics really sort of sparked something in him to be a writer. And I love the fact that he sort of, I won't say any more than that because it's part of the early part of the book, basically how he came to actually be able to start reading things, and there is a side of it where he basically he managed to put himself in the same place as the authors that he started out reading to begin to teach himself how to write by looking at their works. So that is he's literally come full circle. So I think this is why he has such a sort of a solid fan base with people like myself who remember Babylon 5, remember the cartoons, came back to him perhaps in Sense8, and the Thor movie, did an Underworld film as well, which I hadn't realised. I think I've probably seen it, but I'm not sure I noticed that he was involved with it. So I really need to go back now and just check that I've actually watched all these films that he has actually quietly been writing, because what happened was that he had one big success with Changeling, which had Angelina Jolie in it. Clint Eastwood was involved, so really big successful film. And apparently then he just kept on getting offers for all sorts of things. World War Z was him as well, and I have seen that one. But again, I don't think I'd actually twigged that his name was on the credits, because it's not the sort of thing I wasn't really hunting for him, because my brain wasn't in that mode at that point. But yeah, it's definitely worth checking out his filmography, I think, as well, because I'm sure that if you liked his other creative work, you'll like that. And had I not read this autobiography, I wouldn't actually have thought to do that, because I don't really associate him with feature films massively in my head. But he's done perhaps more on that side than you might think. So I'd hesitate to give it a star rating, because I'm not a professional reviewer at all. But for me personally, yeah, difficult book to read, but a real eye opener for your understanding of his work and how he works and why he works, I think. And very accessible. You're not going to need any special industry knowledge. It's perfectly self-explanatory. So if you are starting out on this sort of road, which obviously I'm far too old for, I've done a little bit. I've always enjoyed creative writing myself, but he has dedicated his entire life to doing this, and it shows. And he's just done it. He's done it by doing. He's done it by trying it, knowing that he might fall over doing it, but more often than not, he's developed his experience just by doing. So there are perhaps lessons to be taken from his experience in how he's developed his career over time as well. So I would definitely go for it. I imagine there might even be a paperback version of this available now. I got this quite early on when it was. In fact, I think hardback at the time was the only way I could get it. Oh, I should mention he has done novels. There are at least a couple of novels that he's put out, and he's got a sort of a screenwriting book that he's probably been updating over time as well. So if you're interested in that side of it, he's got sort of a dedicated book to that as well. So it's well worth looking for him as an author separately, in addition to his comics work. And in fact, I must admit, I don't have any of his fiction work outside of comics. So that again might be an avenue that I now go down. So what else can I tell you? Probably not a great deal, actually. I'd be quite interested to see what other people made of it. So I might try and reach out to some of the podcasts that are very active at the moment. And again, we do seem to be in a bit of a golden age when it comes to Babylon 5 podcasts, because there are now a lot of them going simultaneously. When I was doing my synopsis sort of audio pieces on YouTube here, it was quite quiet, and then they suddenly started kind of popping into existence after I started, and unfortunately they're all sort of clearly older hands at it than I am, but I am sort of half wondering whether or not I could simply click the YouTube podcast button and turn them into podcasts. But anyway, I digress. Do go out and get it. Again, this is what it looks like in hardcover. He's got his sort of Superman uniform there hanging up in his wardrobe, and that's what it looks like on the back. So really nice sort of praise on the back for as well. Walter Koenig's got an entry here saying, "I just finished reading Becoming Superman and can, without a mote of hyperbole, state it is one of the most terrifying and inspirational, funny and empathic non-fiction books of our time." And who am I to argue with Bester? Because if I do, he'll just melt my brain and make me say what he wants me to say. So that's it. That's my review of Becoming Superman. Several years late, but at least I can now say that I have actually read it, and I'm glad that I have. As difficult as it was to read in places, it's a nice thing to have read, to understand a bit more around the journey and just how remarkable it was that Babylon 5 got made, kept being made, and achieved what he wanted it to achieve. Shame about Crusade, but but we have the animated movie to look forward to, which at the time of speaking we should be getting a trailer for in about 10 days, I think, give or take. And then we will hopefully see it later on this summer. So, very much looking forward to that and seeing what that might then spark off. But yeah, we will see. So, thanks for listening and watching. Do like and subscribe as ever, and I'll see you when the animated movie comes out. And I will also make a start on doing my Crusade reviews, because once I've done Crusade and Lost Tales, I think I've pretty much covered everything until the animated movie comes out. Now, that's the other interesting thing, of course, is that the irony is in doing Babylon 5 as a 5-year arc, did JMS actually make it very hard then to do follow-ups? Because I'm quite sure that he will come up with new ideas over time, and it might be quite difficult to do new ideas when you've got quite such an established backstory, because it's kind of, how do you then sort of prise that open again? But anyway, we'll see what he does with it all. So that's it for now. Cheers.